My name's Mark Hollis, 39 years old. I run a small renovation business out of Boston. Honest work, long hours, and enough stress to keep a man awake at night. But not the kind that keeps you haunted. That came later. I always thought marriage was supposed to be about consistency. You build something together, habits, a home, trust, and if you work hard enough, it holds. At least that's what I used to believe, before I learned that everything can fall apart because of a single phone left unlocked. It started on a Sunday morning. The house smelled like coffee and sawdust, two of my favorite things. My wife, Elena, was in the kitchen scrolling through her phone while pretending to listen to the radio. She laughed suddenly, a kind of laugh that didn't belong to our marriage anymore. Not cruel, just light. Too light. I looked up from fixing a drawer hinge. What's so funny? She glanced at me for half a second, smile fading. Oh, just something from work. Marketing group chat. You wouldn't care. And just like that, the air between us changed. For a man who spends his life noticing cracks in walls and wood, in foundations, I recognized one forming right there in my kitchen. Later that night, when she went for a shower, I saw her phone light up on the counter. A message. You looked incredible today. Wish I could have said that out loud. No name. Just a number. My chest tightened. The smart thing would have been to ignore it, to ask calmly maybe, or pretend I hadn't seen it. But men like me don't do calm when trust starts leaking through the cracks. I memorized the number. I didn't open the chat. I didn't have to. I knew enough to see the outline of something ugly forming beneath the surface. That night, I couldn't sleep. Elena lay beside me, breathing slow, peaceful. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of every year we'd spent together, the mortgage, the dinners, the fights that always ended in whispered apologies. It was all supposed to mean something. But that message, it felt like a blade slipping quietly between my ribs. I got up around 2 a.m. and sat in the garage with a beer, staring at my workbench. Rows of tools, each one with a purpose, each one designed for precision, not emotion. And I realized something. I didn't need to explode. I didn't need to scream. I just needed evidence. The next day, while she was at work, I called a friend, Cal, a guy I knew from a previous security contract. Ex-cop, now working freelance as a private investigator. I need a favor, I told him. He didn't ask many questions. He didn't have to. When a man calls another man, and his voice is quiet, too quiet, you already know what it's about. By evening, he texted me back. Send me the number. I did. 2 days later, Cal called. You were right, he said. That number belongs to Daniel Cole, works at her firm. Divorced, 42. Been there about 6 months. I swallowed hard. You sure? Yeah. He's got a habit of taking lunch breaks that last an hour and a half. Usually the same days your wife clocks out early. Double quote silence. Cal hesitated. You want me to keep digging? I stared at my reflection in the workshop window. The eyes looking back weren't angry. Not yet. Just cold, focused. Yeah, I said finally. I want everything. For the next week, I went about my days like nothing had changed. Kissed her goodbye in the morning. Ate dinner together at night. Talked about bills, weekend plans, the usual routine. But under all that normality, I was building something. Not with wood or nails this time, but with patience, suspicion, and quiet rage. When Cal sent me the photos, I was in my truck parked outside a client's house. Elena and Daniel, leaving a hotel, his hand on her back. Her smile, that same light, effortless smile she'd given me the first time we met. My stomach dropped. I didn't even blink. I just stared at the pictures until my knuckles went white. That night, I said nothing. She came home, kissed my cheek, asked about my day, and I smiled back like a ghost. But something inside me shifted. Not just hurt, not jealousy. A calm, methodical kind of fury. Because I wasn't going to be the man who screamed and threw things. No, that's what they expect. Noise, drama, chaos. But I've spent my life fixing broken structures. And now, I was going to dismantle one piece by piece until nothing of hers was left standing. Not her secrets, not her comfort, not even her lies. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice, in its purest, coldest form. I learned a long time ago that people reveal themselves in small, repeatable acts, which is why I stopped watching the big gestures, the hotel doors, the kisses in the elevator, and started tracking the tiny ones, the way Elena's hair fell when she told a lie, the minute she paused before answering, the brands on receipts she didn't normally buy. Cal called me midday the next Thursday. He'd been tailing Daniel for 3 days, had the guy's routine memorized like scripture. He meets her on Thursdays, Cal said, by the river, not the hotel. Small diner at first, then the townhouse you saw. He's careful. Anything else? I asked. Yeah, he hesitated. He's got a second phone. 2 numbers. One for business, one for other things. He uses prepaid cards for cabs. He avoids the cameras on purpose. Guy's not sloppy. That last bit grated like sand. He wasn't sloppy. He was practiced. That should have told me everything I needed to know about what I was dealing with. This wasn't some quick fling. It had planning behind it. I started building my own little operation. Nothing dramatic. I'm not some action hero, and I didn't want blood. I wanted facts. I wanted to remove every smoke screen until only the truth remained, naked and incapable of being denied. First, I cataloged. Cal brought more photos, timestamps, a few grainy clips from a traffic cam that suggested the make of the car Daniel drove. I cross-referenced license plates with public registries, narrowed down addresses. And because I still had a business to run, I programmed a small script that alerted me when Elena's calendar entries changed or when unknown charges posted to our joint card. Second, I dug into Daniel. Everyone has a paper trail, divorce files, addresses, a history of consulting work that was more bar tabs than boardrooms. But there was a curious entry in his public filings. He'd listed himself as a project manager for Ridgepoint Ventures, a small outfit that handled subcontracting for larger development firms. Ridgepoint's LinkedIn was sparse, their website thin. That was a red flag. Real companies build noise. Shells hide in silence. I called a former client of mine who'd worked with Ridgepoint on a job. He remembered Daniel as the sorts of man who handled delicate favors. He mitigates friction, keeps things smooth, doesn't like paperwork. Translation, a fixer. Someone you call when you don't want to get fingerprints on the table. Third, I set the trap. If you want information from a man who's careful with his phone, you go analog. People are sloppy with people. So I started introducing variables into Elena's routine, small changes that would force Daniel to take actions I could record. I left the house at odd times, took my lunch out, sometimes drove past the block twice instead of once. I paid cash at gas stations she always used, so there'd be no card trail linking me to anything unusual. I wanted Daniel to feel the world was unpredictable. On a damp Thursday night, I put it into motion. Elena texted at 6:02, running late. Be home by 9? I answered with a picture of the TV, a stupid caption. She replied with a smiley and the word K, calm, casual. I left 2 hours later with a bag of tools and a case of patience. At 7:05, a sedan rolled up behind a decrepit service building by the river. I sat in my truck across the street, lights off, watching with the slow attention of a man who could wait out a storm. Daniel stepped out, checked his phone, and paced. Elena came out 10 minutes later, hair loose, cheeks flushed like someone who'd been walking fast. He smiled the same smile men who keep secrets use, immediate, practiced, friendly. They didn't go into the townhouse. They walked to a public bench beneath a broken street lamp where no one would expect intimacy, and everything would look ordinary if someone glanced their way. They spoke low. He reached for her hand. She let him. I took pictures. Stood like a man at the lip of something I didn't want to fall into. I had the evidence. The raw, clinical kind that steps out of a story and becomes a thing you can point to. When they separated an hour later, Daniel walked to the car, Elena turned back and looked across the river toward the city lights. She didn't see me in my truck. I'd kept low. I watched the way she held herself, as if the act of composing a pose could hide the tremble beneath. She got into the sedan and Daniel drove away. I sat there for a long time, not because the night pressed in, but because I needed the images to sink in. What surprised me wasn't the betrayal. It was how mechanical it all felt. Not an affair, then, but a system she'd plugged into. He had roles. She had roles. Each thing they did fit like parts in a machine. Back at home, I didn't confront her. I made coffee and fixed a squeaky hinge in the kitchen, the kind of domestic nuisances that feel absurd until you realize they're the only normal things left. She came in humming at 10:15, tired, and kissed me on the cheek. I kissed back. I kept quiet. The next morning, Cal handed me something that changed the angle of the hunt. Daniel had a contractor's permit under a company called Clearwater Services. Clearwater listed services for property management, secure transport, and, quietly on a forgotten fact page, confidential logistics. A stub on a job board showed Clearwater was running late-night transfers for a private client in the financial district. The name confidential logistics made my jaw clench. People talk about vanishing people in movies. In real life, it's often about moving things, hard drives, paperwork, identities. Logistics is a language of movement and denial. If Clearwater handled discrete transfers, then they handled things companies wanted untraceable, the kind of things that make marriages more than intimate tragedies. They make them dangerous. The pattern coalesced: Ridgepoint, Clearwater, Arcadia-like shells, late nights, a townhouse on the river. Every breadcrumb pointed to a network that used men like Daniel as hands and women like Elena as access. That night, I made a call to a contact I'd never wanted to need, an old city clerk who owed me for a favor years back. Pull the permit logs for Clearwater, I said, and added, Calder checked for anomalies in transport authorizations last 3 months. The clerk took the bait. Men who had done favors never asked why. They just knew they were to act. The paperwork that arrived 2 days later was a neat little lie. Authorized routes through municipal areas that never quite matched any client file. Off-hours permits that had been rubber-stamped in offices where someone had left a pen with their initials and no signature. It was deliberate obfuscation, the kind built by people who trained themselves to think in shadows. That gave me leverage. Not yet legal leverage. I wasn't turning any of this over to the police. Not until I had clarity and control. No, this was leverage in the more immediate sense. I could make a choice that would either burn her soft life down or cut the threads cleanly. The next move required patience and the kind of cruelty that sits heavy in your gut. I would make her choice be Isabel. People who hide behind plausible deniability rely on privacy as armor. Take that away, and they flinch. Make her see the consequences of each action, and maybe she'd break. Or maybe she'd double down. So I started leaving things within her reach. A receipt from a diner she'd never gone to. Photos of Daniel that she hadn't deleted. An anonymous voicemail on her phone that said, simply, "You can stop now," small things, insinuating themselves into the edges of her confidence. One night, when she was in the shower and the house hummed with the sound of warm water, I left the envelope on the kitchen table. Inside were 3 things: a clear color photo of her and Daniel leaving the hotel, a printed copy of a Clearwater permit with his plate number, and a single line I wrote on a torn shop receipt: "If this ends, end it. If it continues, I'll make it public." I didn't expect confession. I expected calculation, an attempt to patch, to placate, to pretend. But when she came out wrapped in a towel and saw the envelope, something in her face shifted. For the first time since I found the message, her composure cracked. She sat down, hands trembling. And finally, she spoke. "Mark," she said, and the name felt like an accusation and a plea both. "It's not what you think." Her words landed like wet wood. In my chest something opened. Not rage. A tired, heavy defeat. The part of me that had built a life wanted to believe it was salvageable. The part that kept records had already recorded too much. I need to know everything, I replied quietly. Not now. Not all at once. But soon. She nodded like someone agreeing to a sentence she could have fought but chose not to. And in the quiet that followed, for the first time, I allowed the idea through. This wasn't only about taking her down. It was about understanding why she let herself be a part of the machine. If there was a mercy in what I was about to do, it was that I would give her the chance to choose. But I would not let her choice be made in ignorance. She'd acted with eyes open in ways I could prove. That was the balance I wanted to keep. Evidence first, emotion later. The hunt was no longer just a way to punish, it was a way to extract truth. And truth is, in its own way, a kind of salvage. When you force someone into a corner, you learn what they value by what they're willing to sacrifice. First, after I left the envelope on the table, nothing dramatic happened. No confessions, no screens. Elena went to work the next day with a face like a woman carrying a secret she'd already planned to bury. That was worse. People who don't react are either broken or deliberate. Either way, they're dangerous. I didn't wait for her to make a mistake. I made the next move. Cal had been good, quiet, efficient, the kind of guy who knows how to get a tail without being seen. He'd also started feeding me things I didn't want to know. Daniel's rent, paid in cash, a PO box used at odd hours, a courier route that matched the Clearwater permits. Little patterns. Men of habit leave them if you look long enough. I hacked the schedule. Deliberately. I spoofed a maintenance call to Clearwater's listed office. Scheduled a window inspection that would force Daniel to sign paperwork the day after one of his rendezvous. If he was careful, he'd use his burner. If he was sloppy, if he trusted muscle memory, he'd use the company name. Either way, there'd be a trace. He used the company name. I watched the digital playback in my truck, coffee gone cold between my knees. Daniel arrived, clipped in as a technician, signed his name on the pad, and left. I took a photo through the half-closed blinds, a snapshot of arrogance. The man who thought himself unseen had used his own cover to validate his night work. That little victory was a key I turned. With Cal's help, we sent the photo and a carefully worded concerning mail to Clearwater's listed client, contact anonymous. Professional, asking for clarification on after-hours service authorizations. The reply came within an hour, blunt and bureaucratic. Clients are to be verified. Unauthorized personnel will be reported. It had the tone of someone who wanted no trouble. The goal wasn't to get anyone fired immediately. It was to set a chain of tiny collisions, each one small on its own, together lethal. I wanted Elena to feel the pressure from the outside like a weight on her chest. People in hidden systems assume their partners can't see the gears. Once the gears creak in public, they panic. That evening she was different, not scared tight, practiced panic. She brushed past me in the hallway with a paper bag of groceries, avoiding my eyes. I cornered her in the kitchen like a man who had to know the shape of the lie. Who is he, Elena? I asked, steady. No theatrics, just facts. What does Daniel do for you? Who is Arcadia? Who's paying you $3,000 every month? She closed the pantry door slowly, as if trying to keep the world from spilling in. For a heartbeat I saw the woman I married, the hesitation, the knot of doubt, but then she folded herself into armor. He's a project manager, she said. He coordinates vendors. Arcadia is a client. It's legal. Her voice was thin. You're making a problem out of nothing. Arcadia pays you in cash from a shell company. I said, you've been transferring files. You signed permits under false names. The contracts listed under our company show your signature. I watched as words balanced in the air between us. She knew, or she chose to know. She sat down and laughed, a short, bitter sound. You think I would ruin us for money? You've already signed your name to ruin, I said. But truth, when it rattles out, has no grace. She exhausted a litany. Coercion, fear, promises. They said it would be temporary, she whispered. They said they'd protect us. I didn't ever think they'd frame you. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to hold that thread like a lifeline. But the drive and the ledger I'd pulled from her laptop didn't fit her story. There were dated transfers to offshore accounts, notarized PDFs with my forged signature, and a log of data accesses from a server that listed my company IP. Someone had been careful enough to make me look culpable, not just convenient. Criminal. If she'd been threatened, if someone held leverage over her, I needed to know what stick they were using. If she'd been greedy, I needed to know how deep the hole went. Either way, there were partners, and people above them, and partners have names. I pressed her. Give me a name, one name. Whoever you tell me, I'll use him, not you. She stared at the table as if counting screws. Finally she said, Garrett Mallory. The name meant nothing to me at first until Cal's face tightened on the phone. Garrett Mallory, a trustee, a philanthropist with a quiet public profile, donor to libraries, plaques on benches in parks, picture-perfect briefs in community journals. Men like him fund the sort of charity that keeps press off the scent and accounts clean. On paper, he was untouchable. Off paper, he bought deniability the way others buy shoes. You sure? I asked. She nodded. He owns trusts. He uses them to move money without questions. I met him once, at a donor event. I signed paperwork. It felt normal then. They told me to do it. They told me if I cooperated, they'd keep us safe. I could see her fear. But that fear also carried calculation. She wasn't naming someone at random. She'd named the one man who could make a whole house of cards fall or stand. I needed proof. Names are sculptures until you put a chisel to the base. I started with the public, Mallory's foundation filings, donor lists, corporate beneficiaries. They were immaculately neat, exactly the kind of documents meant to hide movement. Then I went to the private, the trust accounts, shell LLCs, wire routing. Those I built through favors. Cal called in a contact at a title company. I traded a small job to a bank clerk who owed me a favor for fixing his home a year back. People who live by favors collect debts. We found a trail, small wires from a community outreach fund to a Cayman trust, then to a courier firm contracted through Clearwater. The courier firm's run sheet matched the nights Daniel was on the river. The trail curved and folded back on itself in elegant loops designed to confuse auditors. That elegance screamed deliberate intent. I sent an anonymous tip, with a single attached photo of Daniel signing the Clearwater pad, to a local investigative reporter who'd once done a piece on illicit property transfers in our city. No names, no accusations, just a whisper. Follow the donors. If the press looked, Mallory's accounts would feel the first itch of scrutiny. A small burn can lead to a larger fire. And while the world was distracted by the tiniest flame, I moved the next piece. You learn in this life to prefer leverage that can't be erased. Legal filings can be shredded, servers can be wiped. But people cannot easily scrub their fingerprints when you force them with their own hands. So I set a bait that would make Mallory's machinery answer for itself. Cal and I arranged a community outreach pickup, a fake vendor me, under a company name I'd never used, called Clearwater, to arrange an emergency late-night transport. Medical supplies for a short no-price clinic. They accepted. Men who run networks like Mallory's depend on plausible deniability. They will move explainable cargo at hours to avoid suspicion. It's the same logic they used for darker things. Daniel arrived, and I watched from the van as he signed off the manifest. He chewed a nicotine strip like every other man who does this work. Jumpy, alert, careful. The pickup would be small, one crate. For Mallory's systems, it was a thread woven into the whole fabric. We followed the truck that night to Blocks, then 5, then into an industrial park I'd never known. The truck pulled up to a loading dock that had been inactive for years. Men moved a crate inside, logged a barcode, and a tablet acknowledged receipt. I took pictures of the barcode. I filmed the timestamp. We didn't touch anything. We didn't need to. We were building an audit trail, one authenticated image at a time. When the truck left, Cal and I kept it on a tail until it reached a separate lot of property fronted as a storage affiliate for Muller Wise Foundation, the kind of place with polite landscaping and wire mesh to keep out kids. But the camera feed from the lot one we'd paid a contractor to route to a drop server showed a small rear room where black cases were stored. Cases labeled with internal project codes that tied directly to Mallory's charitable trust. Releases. I sent the footage, encrypted and anonymized, to the reporter with a headline suggestion and a plea: look into Mallory's affiliate storage. Then I sat back and waited. Waiting is a craft. The world moves slowly when you're trying to expose it. But when the press nudges, people panic, money moves, guards shift, names are called. 2 days later, Mallory's foundation released a terse statement. An ongoing audit is in progress. We assure the community of our transparency. The tone of the statement was polished, but the words betrayed a man who'd been caught parsing between public image and private ledger. The dent had been made. That night Elena came home and sat down without ceremony. For the first time she looked tired in a way she hadn't been before. Sapped, the sheen gone. She reached for my hand and didn't pull away. I didn't want you to get hurt, she said. It was small, it was weak, it was everything. And if I hadn't found out, I asked. She closed her eyes. You would have been the fall guy. The silence after that was a room with no furniture. I had a choice to make: expose everything and let the law take its course, watching as the legal system chewed and spat until the truth was never quite the same, or take the slower, more surgical route where I stripped them of infrastructure piece by piece until their machine stopped working. I opted for the latter. I wanted them to feel each loss as a calculated burn, the way they'd burned people for years. I wanted Mallory to understand that his money could not buy immunity if the ledger itself was inventoried and published with a voice that refused to be bribed. And so I kept pulling threads. Each one was a small, deliberate pain: evidence forwarded here, a discreet call there, pressure in the right quarter. It worked. Mallory moved assets, cleared trustees, and tried to realign his public persona. Daniel grew frantic. He started making mistakes, the very thing I'd been waiting for. He used a card in our city. He left his phone on at times it should have been off. Sloppiness breeds when men are afraid, but the machine has more arms than you expect. As I tightened one, others clutched harder. I could smell the anger in the air, thin, metallic. This would not end cleanly. That night I sat by the window and watched the river, lights broken into strips across the water. The city looked like anything else, indifferent, unaware. Elena slept on the couch. I made coffee and closed tabs on a laptop that had become a ledger of its own. The hunt had become something else now, not just for truth, but for survival. And survival in a world run by men who move money in the dark is a matter of being smarter, quieter, and more persistent than they expect. Part 3 closed on a decision: expose the ledger slowly, methodically, with enough pressure that men like Mallory could not rebuild without leaving a paper trail. But I knew dangerously well that when you pull at a thread in a web, the spider feels it, and spiders do not forgive easily. When you pull others into the light, you have to accept that not everything that was hidden was secret by accident. Some of it was guarded like a dog behind a fence, and it bites when you come close. After Mallory's foundation felt the first nudge from the press, things accelerated. Men with quiet faces and expensive habits began to move like predators smelling blood. They didn't lash out publicly. They tightened. They made men who worked for them nervous, and nervous people make mistakes. That was my advantage. My disadvantage: they noticed the pattern and then noticed me noticing. The first real strike came on a Tuesday. I was in the shop, sanding a reclaimed board for a client's kitchen island, when my phone lit up with Cal's name. He sounded cut breathless. Someone hit the tail, he said. They followed me from the docks. Had even 2 guys. I lost them near the South Loop. Are you okay? I asked. No, my van's been keyed, Mark, windows smashed. I got a brick through the rear quarter last night. Whoever's watching us is escalating. Be careful. The brick through Cal's window was the thing that made this personal in a new way. This wasn't just business recalibration or legal pressure. It was intimidation. It was also clumsy, which means someone wanted to send a message without making martyrs. That night someone left a card tucked under my windshield wiper. Don't go too far. No signature. No threat beyond the implication. It was the kind of thing that used to make men laugh in movies and panic in real life. We doubled down. I called the reporter Rosa who'd run the first whisper. She was brave and she was careful. We need to publish, but stagger, I said. We can't let them scrub everything at once. Keep pressure in legal jurisdictions that freeze assets quickly. Move the story to an international desk. She did her part. Little pieces went out to different outlets. The ledger, the trail of donations, and storage addresses started to look like a map instead of a rumor. But Mallory's people stopped being patient. They shifted from veneers to muscle. Daniel began to miss his late-night texts. He started calling with a tremor. When he did show, he was clumsy, left a lighter in the trunk of his car, logged into a work tablet with his personal account. The more their world closed, the worse they moved. Then Elena came home with a bruise on her forearm. Small, pale, shaped like someone grabbed her to keep her from stepping away. She told me it was from the warehouse. She had to move a crate and the corner nicked her. I wanted to believe that. I also wanted evidence. Cal pushed me quietly. You can't let this be just between you and her. If they do anything physical, we go to the police prepared, but on our terms. You know how this looks otherwise. So we staged. We recorded. We planted a camera in the hallway opposite our house, discreet, low light, so if someone came to our door we'd have more than a footprint. We made sure Cal could be reached at any hour. We set safe words with neighbors. Practicalities, because practicalities save people. A week later, at midnight, a van pulled up outside. 2 men in work jackets walked to our porch. The camera hummed. I watched in real time as they tried the handle. The light on my phone flipped red. I called Cal. He came within 10 minutes, but even before we went out, one of the men had turned and walked away, then idling, then rolling down the street slow as if to say, "We can see you. We could have taken your wife. We chose not to." That night I didn't sleep. Fear is a poor partner for insomnia, but it's a useful lens. It sharpens what you will do. I made a list of the men I trusted and double-checked their alibis. I moved sensitive files off my home network and into burned backed-up drives stored in 3 places. I prepared redundancies for everything. You cannot win a war if you let the other side take your archive. The pressure cut both ways. Mallory's trustees, seeing the heat, began firing contractors who'd been too visible. Some left town. Others got quiet. It felt like an ebb, but the dying embers still burned. It was then I realized the ledger was not the only weapon. Mallory had people who would rather set fires than let himself be dragged to court. Then came the small, awful escalation that changed this from a scandal into a fight. Cal didn't show for a stakeout. He hadn't answered his phone since noon. I drove to his apartment and found the door ajar. Inside, the couch was flipped, cushions ripped. His laptop was gone. The safe under the workbench had been pried open, empty. There were no bodies, no blood. This wasn't murder theater. This was precision theft. They took the things that mattered. The drives, the photos, the copies of the nails. A professional hit. I sat on his kitchen floor and let the dark fill my chest. Something else had changed. While we were busy turning the ledger into evidence, they were busy removing witnesses. That same night Rosa called. Her producer's inbox had been flooded with anonymous threats. One of her confidential sources, an accounts assistant, at Mallory's foundation had recanted. The smear campaigns began. "You have to be careful," she said. "They know who I am talking to. They're trying to choke the faucets." The fight was becoming hydraulic. If they could cut the sources, they could stop the flow. I didn't want to lose Cal. I didn't want to lose Rosa. And I sure as hell didn't want to lose momentum. So I did something I'd never done in my life. I invited a lawyer into my living room. Her name was Anita Bell, and she had a reputation for the kind of quiet tenacity that makes institutions uncomfortable. She listened to the files, looked at the photos Cal had managed to duplicate to a private SD card and had left in my hands that morning, and said something that felt like both a relief and a threat. "You have to force their hand," she said. "You need to make them do something that leaves a public trace. A private ledger buried in trust accounts is hard to prosecute. But if they do something illegal in open air, if they threaten, intimidate, or attempt to erase a witness, you get criminal charges that follow a well-trod path. They can't hide behind philanthropy then." It sounded risky. It sounded exactly like necessity. So we baited them. I arranged a fake release of funds under a shell charity I'd created as a test. Nothing real. Nothing tied to anyone but professional enough to register an accounting entry in Mallory's auxiliary ledgers. It was bait. It was a provocation meant to be tempting. The idea was to make a visible misstep. If Mallory's people moved to intercept, they would leave a legal breadcrumb that law enforcement could take to court. The plan worked too well. 2 nights after the bait was set, the then returned. This time it was obvious. Clumsy men wearing hoodies who had no patience for subtlety. They moved into the alley behind Rose's apartment building and tried to coax a neighbor into giving them access. The neighbor instead called the police. A small scuffle ensued. One of the men panicked and ran right into the arms of an arriving patrol. They arrested one, a skinny kid with tattoos and a look that said he'd been paid to be useful and scared to be left with the bill. He had a business card tucked into his shoe. Clearwater Logistics. That was the hand we needed. The kid talked, not because he wanted to, but because he'd been arrested, and the alternative, staying locked up, was worse. Under questioning, he rattled off names: a supervisor who reported to Daniel, a dispatcher who worked with Mallory's foundation, and, chillingly, the phrase the ledger used to keep things clean: assets in transit. He didn't understand the full scope. He just did the moving. But he gave us enough to create a subpoena chain. Mallory felt cornered. I could see it in the way his public relations team tripled their statements. The foundation preemptively released a neutrality memo. Trustees began resigning to allow for an independent review. That was theater. It also bought time, and time is an asset the wicked use well. I thought we'd gotten lucky. We weren't. Luck is a thermometer for the kind of men who don't tolerate surprises. The day after the arrest, someone broke into my workshop and stripped out the CCTV hard drives. They left a note folded into the palm of my hammer. "Stop." I understood then that this would not be a clean, legal unspooling. They would retaliate in ways that stepped round long. They would turn small, personal things ugly. They would use my job, my friends, my business as levers to pull me into silence. So I escalated. I could have taken the legal path alone, hand everything to the police, wait for indictments. But that left people like Cal vulnerable while the system crawled. I needed leverage that the corrupt would fear, and that meant getting Mallory's men to show their hands publicly. I arranged for a sting with Anita and Rosa. We set up a meeting at a neutral cafe. Mallory's chief operations guy, a mid-tier player we'd identified in the kid's confession, had agreed to meet a vendor. The vendor was Rosa. She was the bait now. She had the bravery and the platform to turn a meeting into an exposure. She wore a hidden recorder. I sat 2 tables away, watching. The man showed up late, polite, and arrogant. At first he tried soft maneuvers: blame, minimization, persuasive flattery. Then Rosa asked the question that pierced the skin. "What are the assets you've been moving?" "People." He laughed nervously. "We move property. Documents, sometimes personnel logistics for sensitive clients. Nothing illegal if the paperwork is intact. Then why the late-night transfers to that storage unit on Northfield? She asked, sliding the photograph across. Why the unmarked crates, the Faraday bags, the off-books manifests? He paled, he stammered, he denied. Then, as recordings often do, the truth spilled. He admitted to moving sensitive materials on behalf of donors. He used the word donor like a talisman to ward off moral consequence. But because Rosa had the recorder, and because the cafe had a camera, and because we'd routed the feed to Anita's secure server, his denial was now a public thing in the small way and a legal thing the moment Anita fed it to the right desk. When he left, he looked like a man who hadn't expected to be heard. He hadn't been, until we arranged that he would be. The hit back came hard and fast. That night, someone broke into Cal's new safe house where he'd fled to keep copies and stole every drive he'd had. Then someone leaked fabrications to a local blogger that I'd sent Rosa fabricated evidence to boost her story. It was a cheap, defective smear. Old money knows the art of cheap smears. Strike credibility, and you break the chain. I thought about stopping. I thought about packing up, leaving town, disappearing into the sameness of a job that doesn't involve ledger hunts and donor trusts. I thought about what it would do to Elena, who'd been arrested earlier but released on bail under heavy conditions. I thought about the bruise on her arm and how tired she looked when she'd told me she'd been scared. But the ledger doesn't stop eating simply because you put on gloves. Men who become machines of erasure continue to click their teeth. My silence would only make other people victims. I couldn't in good conscience step back, so I made a decision no one told me was merciful. I'm not proud of how ugly this part gets, but the ledger had taught me the language of compromise. Sometimes you use the smallest weapon available. There was a courier list, small, printed, and boring, tucked in a folder Cal had left wired to a cloud copy I could still access. It listed pickup routes and a man's name who worked as a driver, a man named Tom Avery. He wasn't high level, but he had a habit of living outside the law in small ways. He owed drinking debts and had a girlfriend he wanted to keep quiet. I approached him with an offer, immunity for testimony in exchange for his ledger entry, exact times, signatures, manifests. He took it. It wasn't noble. It was necessary. People like Tom fold when the cost of not folding becomes loss of everything. He gave us names and times. He told us who signed manifests with Mallory's code. He gave us a map. Within 48 hours we had enough to craft a formal warrant request that Anita queued up and served to the right desk with a prosecutor who'd been watching Mallory's foundation for our months. We gave them something that could not be dismissed as rumor: logistical manifests, recorded confessions, eyewitness accounts, and an arrested courier's admission. The warrant was granted. The raids happened at dawn. They were messy and loud and legal and glorious in a way that felt vindicating. Men in suits were led from offices. Boxes were seized. To trustees were read their rights. For the first time since this began, the ledger's owners saw men in uniforms take custody of what they treated as untouchable. But no victory is clean. That afternoon, as the raids were being logged and reporters shouted questions behind police tape, I got the call that made my mouth taste like metal. Elena had been moved, not to a holding facility, not to safe custody. She was gone, not arrested, not detained, gone. 1 minute she'd been processed and consulting with a public defender. The next, a note on the docket read, Elena Hollis, transfer for witness protection. But the official line smelled like someone trying to close a window. The public defender didn't get a phone call. Her phone went dead. The prosecutor's office claimed there had been a clerical transfer and that she'd been moved to a secure location. They wouldn't say where. I drove through the rain without thoughts that made sense. The backyard smelled of wet cedar. My hands shook as I called numbers that should have had answers. Cal was unreachable. Anita's line went to voicemail. Rose's feed was blowing up with speculation. The police liaison said neutral things about procedure. It felt like a trap. And then, an hour later, a text came from an unknown number. If you want her back alive, stop. Let Mallory go. Publicly apologize. Remove all files and publications. Walk away. They'd taken the one piece that made the ledger's exposure more than evidence. Elena. They were using the one human still cared about as currency. There are moments when a man has to decide whether to bargain with monsters. I sat in my truck and breathed hard until my lungs burned. Then I put the phone down and started making calls. We had two options: pay the blackmail and erase the ledger, let the machine live, and protect Elena for a while, or fight, expose everything, and risk losing her to men who don't bargain when they hold cards. Cal eventually answered. He'd been picked up and roughed at a roadside, told to stop, and released with enough scars to be a warning. He was alive. That mattered. He was shaken but coherent. We do it another way, he said. We don't give them a payment. We make the cost of keeping her too high. How? I asked. We make the ledger public enough that anyone who tries to move her becomes visible. We turn every safe place into a lens. We make them believe letting her go will bring down the house. It was either a bluff or the only plan that made any kind of sense. I didn't like it. I didn't like that it required us to burn what we had guarded. But Elena's life was already a ledger entry in someone else's book. Maybe making that ledger louder was the only way to make it hazardous to them. So we prepared for the final act. Anita coordinated with a federal prosecutor she trusted off the record. Rosa and a network of journalists agreed to publish everything simultaneously if Elena wasn't returned within 24 hours. Cal and I set decoys, fake copies of drives routed through channels in different countries, so that Mallory's people couldn't predict where the real copies were. We sprinkled breadcrumbs that would force them to reveal the hands they used. I sat up all night and watched the sky lighten to gray. The city was waking. Somewhere in the ledger's architecture, a man in a suit was drinking coffee and trying to decide whether to blow up a life to save his. I thought of Elena, how she'd sat, small and silent, in my kitchen. I thought of the bruise on her arm. I thought about what that soft, ordinary woman had cost me in sanity and purpose. When morning came, I had a message from the unknown number. We have her. You have until noon to withdraw or she's moved. No one should ever be forced to choose like that. No one who loves another should have to calculate whether his next move helps or kills. We moved anyway. It was the only thing left that felt like resistance. No one tells you how heavy a single hour can feel until you spend 12 of them counting down the life of someone you love. When the noon deadline came, the world tilted on a hinge I could not see. My phone buzzed with a dozen encrypted pings. Anita, Cal, Rose, all terse and sharp. We had set the mechanism in motion the night before. Mirrored drops of the ledger to 3 international newsrooms. Secure servers in jurisdictions Mallory could not touch overnight. And a legal team ready with emergency subpoenas. We made the ledger noisy enough that anyone who moved it, or moved her, would trip something large in public. At 11:58 a.m., Anita called me on a line we'd kept for this moment. They're trying to move her to a private airfield, she said. We have a tail on 2 SUVs. Federal agents just got eyes on one of the transfer points. Hold tight. Don't engage. I drove without remembering the route. The city blurred into a sneer of taxi lights and wet asphalt. A dozen times I thought of stopping, of calling off everything, of giving them what they wanted, but every instinct that had led me through the last 4 months stayed like a cold wire in my ribs. This was never about winning a court case. It was about getting her home. We watched the feed together, my truck idling beneath an overpass, laptop open, Rosa live in one window, Anita patching calls in another, Cal whispering coordinates into a burner. The SUVs moved like choreography, precise, practiced. The first pull into a crescent lot off an industrial strip, and then surprise federal agents converging from the north. Tires squealed. Men shouted. Flashbangs popped in a way that made the night blush white. The camera feed went wild. The sound was a mechanized roar. One of the SUVs did a hard three-point turn and fled. The other hesitated, then stopped. Men in plain clothes spilled out and grabbed to figures, one limp, one protesting. For half a breath I hoped, and then watched as the limp figure was bundled into an armored vehicle. They brought her to a federal staging area. They sat her on a folding chair under a tarp, hair damp, eyes hollowed wide like someone who'd been awake with her own fear for too long. When she looked up and saw me, there was a flicker surprise, then shame, then relief. She reached for me in a way I recognized as a small animal thing, and I went to her. "Mark," she said like a confession, "are you okay?" My voice was small. The dam had not yet broken. I wanted to cling to her and carry her away and never let her be alone again. But the world had witnesses now. We stood in a ring of agents and questions. They let me talk to her for a few minutes. It was a crash of daylight. She told me about blind rooms, career handoffs, men who smiled and asked for signatures like paperwork, and then told her later what the numbers meant. She said she'd thought she could control it. She said she'd been afraid. She said she regretted what they'd done to me. She cried. I held her and doled out what comfort I had, like rationed food. And then the legal machinery took over. Agents asked questions. Anita and the prosecutor worked their lines. Mallory's people, if they were anywhere, pivoted in damage control, but the ledger had already spread through enough nodes that panic set in among his trustees and contractors. Where they could, they moved to save themselves. Where they could not, they lied. The next 48 hours were a blur of affidavit signatures, emergency depositions, and loud, ugly televised pieces. Rose's editors ran a coordinated release with large, ugly photos of manifests and storage locations. International outlets picked up the pieces because our parallel drops had planted seeds in their inboxes, and they blossomed into headlines too quick to be suppressed overnight. Mallory fought. He sued. He called in favors. He deposited legal threats and PR that smelled of desperation. He denied. He explained. He promised transparency and outrage. But his trustees began to cut him loose. The foundation's bank accounts were frozen by emergency orders from two jurisdictions that couldn't be moved with a phone call. People who'd once flushed donations up and down the chain started naming dates and transactions that matched our ledger like keys fitting locks. Daniel, poor, small, cowardly Daniel, was rounded up. He tried to bargain with names. He tried to spit out people he thought would save him. Most of them were already gone. Men who built quiet corridors for their crimes don't get to command loyalty when the house collapses around them. Still, the ledger has claws. Not everything the ledger touches dies. Some sections scrape and live on in different forms. We lost Cal for a month. He went into hiding, then reappeared with a hollow look like the vanishing had taken little pieces of him. Rosa faced legal threats and anonymous smear pieces posted on sites that trade in rumor. Anita, save her, worked herself down to a thin wire of exhaustion, but she kept pressing. She'd done this before. She knew how to hold a prosecutor's attention until the evidence would not be smothered. A week later, Mallory was indicted publicly. His face on the news looked small in legal stills, age eating into his carefully curated composure. The charges were thick: conspiracy, illicit transport, obstruction, money laundering. The headline writers had an easy time of it. For all his money and influence, he did not leave the courtroom avoiding the cameras. He stepped into them like a man used to being adored who now expected the same eyes to dismantle him and Elena. The government offered a deal: cooperation in exchange for leniency. She took it. She told the prosecutors what she could: names, dates, locations. Her testimony sealed warrants. She saved herself in pieces, and every piece of information she gave came with a cost that left her softer and less present in the world. When the hearings came, she sat under deposition glass and told the truth like a penance. Sometimes the truth is what cleans you, and sometimes it is what burns you. Both were true for her. We did not walk out unscathed. The ledger had already taken a ledger of its own from us. Trust, a marriage, the rhythm of our days. The house echoed for months. Friends took sides. Contracts evaporated. My boat of normalcy had been rammed and sunk. There were other costs I didn't foresee. Men we'd exposed took petty private revenge calls to clients with half-truths meant to dry up work, anonymous complaints, a late-night hammer through a window at a shop. You cannot be the man who shines a light into rotten places without making some of those places resent the light. In court, Elena's cooperation made a difference. Witnesses flipped. Trustees were compelled to testify. The prosecutors leaned on paper no amount of money could rewrite signed manifests. Chain of custody screenshots timestamped in immutable logs. Audio confessions from small players like Tom Avery. The machinery of evidence began to grind, and it ground men like Mallory down. We did get some measure of retribution. Mallory was held pending trial in a courthouse that hummed with cameras and public fury. Daniel got time. He pleaded guilty to couriering illicit goods and cooperated to reduce his sentence. Clearwater's senior manager was indicted. The foundation underwent a trustee purge and was restructured under court supervision. But there were no theatrical moments of catharsis, a body dragged into sunlight, a villain handcuffed and wailing. Justice is far quieter, less satisfying in its timing, more enduring in its bureaucratic insistence. The ledger's exposure didn't erase what had been done. It made it impossible for that particular gang to hide under civic goodwill for a long time. After the trials, after the fines and the restructuring, after the trustees read meek statements to cameras, Elena and I sat in our kitchen the night the last of the televised hearings aired. The house was quieter than it had been in years. Our daughter, if the reader remembers the Inkton life I once kept for ourselves, had been carried off during the worst of it by a sister until the legal dust settled. We had to rebuild that trust first. It was far harder than any legal fight. We tried therapy. We tried silence. Sometimes I would find her in the early morning in the garage, hands raw from work she'd never done before, bent on making something real with her hands. As if craft could stitch what money and lies shredded. She apologized, sometimes to nobody and everyone. I accepted apologies the way a man does who knows a reparative life is composed of small acts, not decorations. For my part, I walked away from the ledger work that had built me. Not because I was disillusioned, God knows I wasn't, but because exposure had taught me something mundane. Being useful doesn't require you to live under shadowed ledger. I took fewer clients, did pro bono work for places needing real protection against the kind of corruption we'd found, and taught a short class at a community college about ethical small business practices and how to spot shell company roots. It felt modest and steady. It felt like Bond. A year later, Mallory was convicted. The sentence wasn't as long as a tabloid would have liked, but it was long enough to be a life turned smaller. That outcome is cold comfort to the families who'd been affected. There were still names missing on the lists, files with gaps where a person once was. Behind every ledger entry is a human life with a story no database can retrieve. We never fully recovered what the ledger took from us. Elena and I separated, not the violent, cinematic breakup I sometimes imagined when I was angry, but a slow, practical unweaving of two lives that no longer fit comfortably together. We share occasionally normal things for the kids' school runs, dental appointments, lazy weekends, and those small acts tethered us to some form of civility. We learned to keep the past like a heavy piece of furniture in one room and not drag it through the whole house. There were days I felt proud of what we'd done. We'd pulled a dangerous machine into sunlight. We'd made people pay in documented ways. We'd protected at least some potential future victims by revealing methods that could no longer be easily repeated. But there were evenings I lay awake feeling hollow. thinking of the things no ledger could account for, the trust that had been eaten away, the innocent hours lost, the scar tissue of a life rearranged. If the ledger's final lesson was anything, it was grim and simple. Systems built on silence die when enough people refuse to be quiet. Exposure is messy, loud, and requires sacrifice. The cost will be paid in lives that can't be reversed, but the ledger will not be able to function in the same way again. That is not a consolation for the people harmed, but it is the only kind of repair a broken city can afford. I still keep copies secure, encrypted, redundant, in places that smell like cedar and oil, because the world turns and men like Mallory find new angles. It's paranoia, maybe, or maybe prudence. Either way, I sleep more than I did during the hunt. I drink less. I teach more. I pay attention to the small things again, the squeak of a hinge, the way a child laughs at breakfast. Those ordinary sounds are the repair work. Months after the trials, Rosa sent me a message. They asked me why I kept writing. I said, because you owe to the ones who have no ledger. Because somebody has to look. That felt right. The ledger had been a catalogue of harm. We'd burned the pages in public until the ash could be catalogued and used to build something that, if only marginally, would stop the next ledger from forming. In the end, I learned that revenge is a poor soul's currency. Justice is slow and indifferent, and sometimes gets the price wrong. What matters is the small, steady work you do afterward, teaching, fixing, tending a life that almost broke, and the rare, unexpected moments when someone thanks you for refusing to look the other way. Some nights I still drive past the river with my headlights off and watch the city lights scatter on the water. The townhouse where they met is boarded up now. A new charity has a plaque where Mallory's used to hand. People walk dogs there and push strollers. The ledger is gone from public view, replaced by new things and new faces. That's how the world keeps going. But when I pass that stretch of river, I pull my coat tighter and remember how quiet betrayal can be and how loudly it can be answered when enough people decide to make it public. If this story has an ending, it's small and steady. We keep the ledger out of the dark. We keep the copies in places that men with money can't easily reach. We teach people how this works. And when the world turns, we do the ordinary thing. We build again, nail by nail, because rebuilding is the only kind of justice you can live inside.